Over the cloud. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. I've had that thought late before, but oh my goodness, look at all those people calling in. There's so many people calling in. It's unbelievable. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to continue as you call in. If you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute and the video off so we can have kind of the presenters be the focus of the day, because we can see you guys as you dial in. So I'll start to manage that. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you, Paul. Nikki, go.
All right. Is this thing on?
Yes, it is. Yes,
okay.
It is.
Awesome. Well, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Lustig, and I head up internal learning and development at GitHub. And for those of you who may not know, GitHub is a code hosting platform for version control and collaboration. Many of the companies you work at, if you're not an engineer, are likely using GitHub, so that's pretty cool. And the idea is that it lets you and others work on projects from anywhere. And it's a pretty cool company in the sense that we operate in terms of our remote culture just like we think about our software. And I'm excited to share a little bit more about that in this conversation. I know Paul has some stuff in that genre as well. But I thought I'd share a little bit about me and who I am and where I've come from and sort of how I got here to help kick it off. And then I'm happy to sort of shift and bob and weave and talk about whatever people are most interested in. Is that a good place to start?
Perfect. That sounds good.
Cool. So as I shared, I'm Nikki. I've been at GitHub for about a year, and we'll definitely talk more about the remote culture that we're building there. But I thought it'd be kind of cool to share that prior to GitHub, I actually relocated to San Francisco from LA to help build out the learning and development team at Twitter. I was there for about 3.5 years, helping to scale the company. When I started, we were about 1,200 employees, and by the time I left, we were about 4,200, and I believe the company is still continuing to learn and grow and scale. And it's pretty cool because Twitter has companies all over the globe, whereas when I've come to GitHub, we're very much distributed. And so it's been a really interesting learning curve for me personally as just an individual employee and what that means to work in this remote culture, but also as I head up L&D and what does that mean for building culture, and how do I have to change my approach and my philosophy and the way that we design, and how do we experiment to try and help build a community when you can't just yank people in a room for a day of training. There's a lot of other costs, physical, travel, time to consider. So I've been in the learning and development space for about 8 years, focused mostly on management, leadership, professional development. I do a lot on the team development side. I'm really passionate about helping teams connect and figure out ways to communicate more effectively, figure out what are the communication styles, how do you manage conflicts, and how do you help define what is your purpose and what no other team can do. It's something that I'm really passionate about. I also deep dive into org development and work on helping the company understand what are employees saying across the company and how do we use that as a starting point to build better culture, to help continue to iterate and improve on things that we're doing at the company-wide scale. So I kind of see myself as like a connector of the dots in a lot of different ways. And maybe that's a good place to start. And, cool.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Nikki. We'll hand it then to Paul. I want you to introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today.
Sure thing. So my name is Paul Frields, and I am the manager of the Fedora engineering team, which is part of the larger engineering department at Red Hat that does the R&D that builds our products. I guess I'm going to backtrack a little bit and maybe start further back in history of how I got started in communities and remote cultures. I started volunteering for the Fedora project, the services for which my team now provides at Red Hat. But I started as a volunteer with that project before I was ever part of Red Hat. And that project kind of taught me a lot of what I learned over the years in terms of what it means to collaborate remotely with people, the kind of dimensions there are to that, how you can influence and participate with people, and how you can make it possible for other people to work better and smarter together. And I took those lessons with me into Red Hat. I got hired by them some years later as the project leader for the Fedora community. For those of you who don't know what Fedora is, it's essentially a project for promoting free and open source software, the kind of software that you actually find all over the place at GitHub. I mean, GitHub, not to maybe puff Nicky up too much here, but I'm going to do a little bit of that. GitHub's been a remarkable tool, right, for promoting open source culture worldwide, right? One of the best places that you can find open source collaboration, right? It's really pushed that to the next level. Fedora actually uses the same kind of concepts to develop an operating system platform and some other deliverables that revolve around that anyone is able to freely download. They can use it, they can study it, they can modify it, and with only a few small requirements like they have to do with trademarks and things of that nature, they can republish those things and remix it for their own use. And that helps Red Hat as well, because we basically use Fedora as a way to do advanced technical selection of the best technologies, the best integrations, and we use that to help power the development of our enterprise level products, which we make for companies around the world. I mean, essentially, almost 100% of the money that moves at a large scale around the world passes through Red Hat's products. So we power equities markets, the stock markets like the New York Stock Exchange and Euronext, the Nikkei. They run on RHEL. I'm using the acronym without explaining. Red Hat Enterprise Linux is our flagship operating system platform, and so you can think of that as a kind of a hardened enterprise level grade operating system that starts with Fedora, but then goes through a lot of fixes and hardening. So when I joined Red Hat, I was working with the Fedora community as a leader in that project, helping the community kind of understand how we could work better, what are some new trends that we could be working on, how to get those teams working together so that every 6 months we were able to put out a new release of this operating system. Later, I went to work internally for Red Hat, and I actually was a development coordinator for Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, which is our current flagship operating system product. Now I manage the Fedora engineering team, which provides services both at the infrastructure levels, so doing system administration, also application development, kernel integration, and even some design and user experience services for the community at large. So we're not the entirety of the Fedora community by any stretch of the imagination. We're like a minuscule part of it, but we are a part that Red Hat sponsors, underwrites, and pays full-time salaries for a small team of people, about 15 people, that work full-time on Fedora to enable the community to get to the next level for each new release that we do. So that's one of the ways that we collaborate with the open source community.
So Paul, your team, so I think what I heard you just say, you have 15 people that you manage remotely, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we are all remote. There are a few of us who are located near Red Hat offices, but we are scattered across the globe. So I've got people all the way from Australia, across India, Netherlands, France, the US.
And you've been, your remote team, how long, forgive me if you said this, how long have you been managing a remote team?
I've been doing that for about 4.5 years now.
All right. Nicky, how many folks do you, so GitHub, you said is all remote. Like there's nobody in an office anywhere, is that right?
No. So let me back up and share a little bit about how GitHub is structured. So we're a very distributed company. We have over 600 hubbers, and I'd say about 60% of us are remote. I think last I heard we had employees in 17 different countries in 34 states. And most recently, and we're working on publishing our most current diversity report. But the numbers that I saw recently said that we've got about 38% of us based in HQ. We have a big flagship office here in San Francisco. I'm actually dialed in from home, which again is a nice perk of remote life. But 38% of our hubbers call San Francisco an HQ home, and that could be any sort of degree of I come in once a week, once a month, once a quarter, to I'm in the office 5 days a week. And it really just depends on what it is that works for you and for your team. 40% of us are US-based remote, and we consider a workplace anywhere that has a laptop and an internet connection. Could be a hammock somewhere if you are so lucky. And we've got about 20% of the company that is international remote. We do have some co-working spaces in Boulder, in Tokyo, and in Amsterdam. And those are spaces where employees can come, float in, float out, just like HQ. They're meant to be places where people can come together, find a space that works for them. Sometimes people's personal situations change. Maybe, they have a noisy roommate or a new baby and they want to come in and create a space that's a little bit more focused, or maybe sometimes the office is a little louder and they want to go work from home or do a deep thinking day, which is something I like to do. I tend to work from home on Fridays. But we do have I'd say our remote hubbers, about 10% opt to working from those co-working spaces, should they require a physical space to get together and do their work.
So what I'm going to try to do in this session is we talked about this before, but for everybody dialing in, is I think it's most interesting when Nikki and Paul actually ask each other questions, because they don't know each other from before this. And so I guess, Nikki, Paul's the remote work veteran here. Is there, I guess maybe there's something we can learn from Paul?
Oh my gosh. I am sure there's a ton that I can learn from Paul. And as I shared, I'm on a personal upward learning path here in terms of understanding the best way to be a hubber. We call ourselves hubbers. At GitHub, everything has hub. So one thing that we think about, and Paul, I'd love to learn from you, is whether you are someone who works from home or you're someone that works from the office. At some point, all of us are distributed because we have to figure out how to be connected with people who are not in the same location as us. And so I'd love to learn, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how do you stay connected and build a sense of community when you're separate from the rest of the folks on your team, but also even more, I guess, more curiosity to understand what does that look like when you're interacting with people who are co-located on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm, right. Well, so, Red Hat is a pretty large company. We've got over 10,000 employees at this point, and I think more than 85 offices now in 35 countries. So there are a lot of Red Hatters who are co-located. I don't have a current number in front of me, unfortunately, for people who label themselves as remotees. But it's a sizable number. I think probably more so in the engineering departments and a few of the other technical services, as opposed to, and of course our consultant and sales folks, as opposed to, maybe people who are in product marketing or the back office, finance, things like that, who are, tend to be located in the offices. So I'm definitely one of those people who I work from home. I work from home 100% of the time, or roughly 100% of the time. I do visit several of the offices from time to time. Specifically, my home office is considered Westford, Massachusetts, because that's where a big component of our U.S. engineering is. But I probably tend to visit equally often our Raleigh, North Carolina headquarters. And what I've found is that each office that I've visited, although they kind of inherit some of maybe the broad strokes of Red Hat culture, so these ideas of freedom and accountability to each other and collaboration, right, and trying to basically find the best solutions through an open process. those things carry through, but you also get like a bit of local color at each office. That's something that for me, I definitely think carries through in building our specific team culture as well, right? Because I've got remote folks on our team in all sorts of geographic areas. And so, being aware of some of the cultural differences that happen from place to place. So for example, there are specific communication styles that you might find in one country versus another, or one region versus another. As a manager, I feel like I need to be sensitive to those differences, and so that will influence the way I deal with some of my associates versus others.
What's an example of that, Paul? I think that's really important, and it's something that I've always thought about, but I don't. Something that you like. What is it? What is some sort of methodology that you've adopted based on kind of a regional communication style?
Yeah. So I found that, there are, and again, I don't really want to get too specific on, exact countries that might nail us down to one person in the team. But I've definitely found, because I don't know who's going to watch this later, and they'll be like, "Hey, I know who you're talking about." I feel like in a couple of the countries where I have people located, there's a communication style that is very straightforward, and might even, maybe by American standards, be considered abrupt or maybe a little brusque, right? And so being aware of that as a manager, I know that I can apply a filter to that conversation when I'm hearing somebody maybe talk about an issue that they're having with either another team or with me or with another person, and be able to understand that they're simply trying to get to the bottom of a problem, right? And so at the larger sense, for me, the interesting thing about managing in that kind of remote environment is just, again, being sensitive to those cultural differences, and then knowing that it's a good idea to kind of apply a filter and not necessarily your own communication style to that. Like, be willing to accept that input and then process it a bit, and think about it before, maybe just responding based on your own communications bend.
Yeah, I think we can all, think about the time when we had a miscommunication over text, and it's probably the majority of that is probably pretty hard. So I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I was going to ask Nicky. I mean, Nicky, have you run into that? Like, are there any like broad trends that you see like that over the different areas that hubbers are?
It's interesting. I haven't seen it as much on the regional scale. I definitely have seen some differences as the company has continued to grow in scale. When GitHub started, it was, the typical tech story of a couple folks, and it continued to grow. And I think what's really interesting about GitHub, and I'd be curious about Red Hat as well, is from the beginning, remote was a big part of our DNA. And so this was the way that the company started, and really the foundation for how GitHub came to be. It's about creating a space for collaboration. And so the tool itself is pretty heavy on documentation. And again, that was a learning curve for me, because you can't have everyone physically in the same space. And so there's a lot more documentation. And I think one of the challenges was, in the beginning at least, like, there's no sarcastic font. There's no font for tone. And it's kind of difficult to figure out, what do you mean by that? And so I think that there may have been some original friction for people as they were documenting. Americans tend to be more direct, and some other cultures are less direct. And so we've sort of ebbed and flowed. And I think one of the cool features that GitHub has added in is this opportunity to have emojis, because tone comes across really differently when you have a winky face versus an eye roll versus like a thumbs down or a thumbs up. And so you can sort of give that intonation and try and get a little bit more of the intent behind the language itself. So I've seen us integrate some of that as well. And I think that will continue to be a challenge as, new people join the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something that's really interesting about not just remote cultures, but also a company that's in a really rapid period of growth and acceleration, is how do you maintain that culture as you continue to scale? Or how do you make sure that people have the context of the original conversation, which I think, as you know, is a feature of GitHub, that you can see all of the changes in the prior conversation. And so being able to give full context and maybe being a little bit more clear, or taking the time to be verbose, or using bullet points to be able to structure your communication in a way that stands the test of time, that doesn't require sort of like the nuance of being in the room, is one way we sort of get around that.
Right. And, there's something that you put your finger on in there that was really important, which is the development of that remote culture via the tools. And you talked about documentation. Obviously, GitHub as, the big product behind the company, or in front of the company, as the case might be. You guys are capturing basically in the product that you're putting out there. And so definitely that's a very easy thing for everyone to agree on. Something that I found that I would say is a big difference inside Red Hat is that there's definitely not one tool for that work, right? Because obviously we've got a specific product line. It's pretty wide at this point and pretty varied, but it's at a much lower level, right? From, operating system to the hybrid cloud, to middleware, et cetera. So there's not really a collaborative suite per se that Red Hat puts out there. There are a lot of open source tools, however, for collaboration, right? And GitHub is one that some of our projects use, some of our teams use. There are other source code management systems that other teams use, but not even the idea of just the source code management is as the one canonical place to have those discussions. Can make things kind of complicated, right? For building a sense of remote connectedness and an equal footing between people who are co-located and people who are dispersed, right? And so one of the things I think that really points to, and it seems like GitHub definitely has a pre-decided answer, which is great, right? It's something that everyone can agree on. I would say in cases where you don't have something like that, it's important when you're trying to build a team or culture to have an agreement on what that venue is going to be, right? Is it going to be, a set of Google Docs? If so, where is that stuff linked? How do they get to it? Is it going to be some sort of content management system that the whole team or organization uses? And there's a variety of choices for all of these, right? I don't want to get too deeply into like this tool versus that tool, but I think having that agreement is really important, because if people don't know kind of where to start or where to have the relevant discussion and make the decision and have it documented and have some history and some traceability, it gets a lot more difficult down the road to avoid that trap of, oh, the following people have this institutional knowledge and you have to go to the guy on the mountain to figure out what the real answer is, right? You definitely don't want that, because that, the accessibility of that person sort of determines the scalability of the whole culture building exercise.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that's pretty cool, and a couple things that was, delightful to learn about when I joined GitHub, are a couple different ways that we do stay more connected, and we do document. Of course, we use GitHub at GitHub. But would it be helpful and interesting to the group if I talked a little bit about some of the tools we use for both async and sync communication?
Sure, I think we can touch on it.
Cool. So one thing that we do that I thought was really cool is we do a once a month all hands, where everyone dials in, if you can, synchronously. And we give updates that are happening around the business and feature different teams. But we totally get it. Whether you're in the time zone or you're not in the time zone, it might be the middle of night for you. We have a pretty cool feature where we record all of them and we have them transcribed and hosted internally. So you can access all of the prior all hands. They're searchable, which is pretty cool. And it's a great way to refer to things. And because they're transcribed, I think we use an external company, you can find that specific word, click on it, and it'll bring you to that point in the video. So I think that's been a really nice way that we can preserve some of the energy. You're not just reading a digest or a debrief, but you're getting to see it. And if you happen to be participating synchronously, there's always a Q&A. And if not, there's a follow-up opportunity. We also do what we call office hours, which is a little bit non-traditional. It's not like we sit in a room and you can come pop in this conference room if you want to talk to the L&D team. But rather we do office hours twice a month where different teams, we have this really cool green room studio in our office, and we'll bring in different teams to come give a 15 or 20-minute overview of some cool stuff they're working on. Again, we record it, and people can use an anonymous tool to type in Q&A. They can make it non-anonymous if they like as well. And so I think being able to record and capture some of the energy, being able to hear it directly from the individuals who are leading the work or leading the way is a nice way to be able to share and preserve some of that culture across the teams as well. We also use Slack, which is real time, and I know we've got some remote opt-in channels, so people will share tips and best practices or, gotchas for folks who are also remote. One really interesting issue that I liked recently was a lot of remote hubbers were taking pictures of their workstations and sharing what it looks like to actually work from home. So do they have it in their second bedroom? Is it a different space? What's their setup? What sort of technology do they use? What sort of cool gear do they have, like Paul's using? Since I don't work remote as often, I haven't done that much of an investment, but I do have the double screen. So it's been kind of cool to get that sort of individual personal flair, or that's part of the culture as well, as giving people the freedom to set things up in the way that works for them, and then connecting them together to continue to iterate and improve upon what is or what isn't working.
It does seem like, the text, like where remote kind of sort of settles into text, it feels like a very much a flattening of personalities. And so we talked about emojis, but I think, Nikki, what you're talking about is, these videos that actually, even if you watch it afterwards, bring to life these people. So, I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Paul, is there anything that you guys do to kind of to unflatten the text-based relationship that remote cultures can be?
For sure. So, our approach to that flattening, though, is actually a bit purposeful, I would say, in the Fedora community where my team spends most of their time. The reason being that we want to make sure that we're not disadvantaging folks who are part of that community who maybe are in low bandwidth situations. They may not have access to download big videos. It's absolutely a fantastic asset to have. For places where, broadband is widely available. So, the US and Europe, we also have places where we have many community members collaborating with us, say in parts of Asia, like India, or a couple African nations where you don't have that high bandwidth available. So, the text that flattening, it's kind of a cost that we live with in order to get the benefit of a very broad community. On the other hand, for the purposes of building community around Red Hat, the purposes of building culture around Red Hat and a shared sense of, where we work, as opposed to, the open source community at large, I think definitely having some tools available like a shared real-time communication channel. We use mailing lists throughout the company, again, kind of text-based, but also a great way to store and forward large conversations, like the threads that you might read on social media. We have a collaborative content management system that we use based on Jive. Internally, where we store a lot of documents where people can refer to information on different teams. We use video chat a lot at Red Hat. And also, like Nicky was mentioning, making recordings of most of those meetings, right? Whether they're for get to know you purposes, or even for programmatic purposes, like projects that we're working on. And that way, people around the globe, if they're not able to dial into the meeting, but they're interested in what's going on and they want to be part of that open conversation, they can use those tools to catch up on decisions that are made and on the discussion that went into them. Also, there's kind of these meta, sort of these meta activities. One of my favorite times of year is a week-long celebration of Red Hat culture that we do internally called We Are Red Hat Week. And it's a time where even though we have small activities that occur around the year, it's a week where we very much focus on giving people around the company and around the globe a platform to talk about what's important to them about working at Red Hat, right? Why they're passionate about what they do, to be able to tell some success stories, talk about the people that they work with and how, their passion kind of becomes, that person's passion as well, and how we kind of can feed each other in a positive way. And that extends to remotees as well. So there's always a special segment of We Are Red Hat Week where the internal brand organization that promotes this activity, they make a special effort every year to include remote folks around the globe in what's going on, and they set up some special like prompts for us to work from. Like here's an idea, right? And this is something that I've actually used many times. Where I live in Virginia in the U.S., we have a number of Red Hatters around the state, and there's a good half dozen to a dozen that are within, I would say, a reasonable driving distance from where I live, say, 50 miles or, whatever, 100 kilometers for people here who are not in the US. And we tend to gather during Red Hat Week. We always set a date when we will get together and have an out of the office activity. So last year we did an escape room, where you get people together into a team and you solve a bunch of puzzles in order to, escape this locked room. And it was a lot of fun. And then after that, of course, there was, going to have beverages of whatever variety, right, down the road and have the fun conversation about what you did and how work is going and talking about the projects that you're involved in. And we always take photos of that and contribute them to the pool that gets shared around the company. And one of the other channels I think that as a follow-on to this is there's an internal monthly a quarterly news magazine or brand magazine where lots of activities around the company are highlighted in video segments. So it's usually about a half hour or so, called The Show. And it promotes different things that are happening around the company. It might be a new product that was introduced, a new office that was opened, who had the best party last quarter for when the show was released. There was a dance party at the Renana office in Israel. So, seeing those things and seeing your colleagues or people maybe that you don't know personally or whose name you've seen and work around the globe from you, seeing them just enjoying their job really builds the sense of belonging, and it really promotes a sense of togetherness, right? That we're all one big team, even though we may be very far apart geographically.
I've gotten a few questions actually that I think tie into this, which is, there's a question about how do you actually, beyond sort of the technical capacity, how do you build relationships, which I think is part of what you're talking about. And I think it dials in that, like, bringing the people to life in a way, so getting people together. But there's also a question about how often should these things happen, whether they're kind of a working in person or like an all hands. I mean, what's ideal? I mean, you were just talking about kind of a quarterly touch with the show. There's a yearly thing with the get together in person. Like, what's the, I mean, there's probably a bunch of different, levels to this, but like, what's ideal? What would be the ideal amount of time that you should have? I don't know, something that's a little more, I don't know, bringing people a little closer together, right? Whether that's like text to video or video to the person. I don't know. Like, what is that? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Happy to jump in here as well. I think that, like Paul was sharing, there are definitely some different rhythms that you can create. And I think it's about having some consistency so people know what to expect. We do a weekly, we call it the TLDR. It's a weekly digest of the most popular issues, something that's happening in the business, upcoming cool stuff to know about. So we do that on a weekly basis. We do our office hours bi-weekly and our all hands once a month. So those are some ways to sort of check in and stay up to date on what's happening across the company. On a daily basis, we've got the Slack ongoing threads and GitHub for GitHub, which is another way. But there's so many different communication channels that it can be challenging. I think the question around how do you build some natural rhythms to come together and how do you build more of the social side is one we continue to experiment with. We did for a long time a yearly company-wide summit where we come together for 4 or 5 days, and there were elements of presentations from the leadership, from different parts of the business. There was a lot of hands-on and philanthropy opportunities, some more social fun activities. I think one group did whitewater rafting, and I did death-defying downhill mountain biking, which I learned is not in my skill set. I'll stick to the road cycling for now. But just more fun ways to come together. And also there's combinations of different learning sessions that were happening throughout that week. So a lot of what people really enjoyed about it was the spontaneity and the sort of serendipitous interactions that you got to have with people who maybe, like Paul was sharing, you only got to see their name on a Slack channel, and now you get to put a face, not just an avatar, to it. So that was a nice way to sort of have that company-wide way, but we continue to grow and we're trying to figure out how does that work for us, especially as more and more people are remote for whatever reasons. And then we do have some different team level ways for teams to come together and connect. Twice a year is sort of the average recommendation where we give teams a budget and they can come together, and we help, and my team is really excited to partner with teams to design a thoughtful agenda about how to come together. Usually there is an element of goal setting and review, celebration, retrospectives about what worked, what didn't work, and not just the work itself, but how we work together as a team. Some social things, we always like to give back to the community. That's a really big part of our values at GitHub is positive impact, and being able to go and give back is a big thing that we like to do, and I think bonds people. Another thing that you might consider is we have a travel stipend for Hubbers to be able to come visit different offices.
Okay.
And we're also looking at having execs work out of different offices, so you can have a chance to have that hallway conversation, which you don't get when you have like a very specific Zoom meeting window.
Right.
But I also think it's pretty cool. Like, one of the things that excited me personally about coming to GitHub and working in more of this remote, non-traditional environment is really rethinking how we build a community of peers to learn together. Like I said before, it's really difficult to pull people in a room. And so how do we experiment with technology and bring people together to have a conversation where it's less about me teaching them a model or lecturing them, but more around creating the space for people to connect and say, oh my gosh, I'm a manager in engineering and you're a manager in sales, and we're both struggling with this same management idea. And so we've been experimenting with Zoom and some of this breakout functionality, which has been pretty cool. Or instead of coming together and talking about the content in real time, I call it like flipping the classroom almost, where you'll watch a video or read an article or do some self-reflection or some sort of assessment, and then come together and actually have more of that conversation. Do sort of the synchronous conversation, relationship building, sharing of ideas and challenges, and more of the async, like here's the tactical components of that.
It's interesting. We like you said, that we just started doing a book club here at my company, which I think is kind of interesting. What I'm taking away from this is that you can't just flip a switch and say, okay, now we're remote and everybody just work from home, do the same thing, right? To me, it feels, what I'm hearing is, yes, you're going to continue to work in the business, but there has to be a very explicit effort to work on the business, which is not typically rank and file, let's say, their job. And to me, it seems like a paradigm shift. Does that sound, Paul, does that sound like, am I sort of like getting into something that seems right? Because I'm not a remote manager.
Yeah, so that's an interesting way of looking at it, that we each kind of carry a commitment and an accountability to sort of promulgate the culture around to our peers, to each other, to subordinates, even to our managers sometimes, right? Kind of reminding them, here's where we come from. And, especially in a company like Red Hat, where we have a significant remote component, but it is not the biggest part of the company. Unlike GitHub, that becomes it can be a struggle at times, right? To make sure that people are making sure to leave a space for the remote folks to be on an even footing with the folks who are co-located. So yeah, I think we all bear a responsibility for, and especially managers, for making that space for people. I really liked what Nicky was talking about the way that you set up activities to remind people that it's, their work as a remotee is more than just kind of sitting down at a computer, right, and communicating facelessly, right? That we want to build social bonds as part of the culture. On my team, we will do a few times a year, we will do specific video conferences just to have everybody in the same place at one time. It's unfortunate, it's a little challenging, right? Because of the way the time zones work out. And typically how it happens is I'm the one common link between two separate conferences, right? We usually have one that's for the APAC folks and in eastern part of Europe, so they can make it there, and then another one later in the day so that I can catch everybody in the USA. Because there's really no one time that works for everyone. However, I think like Nicky mentioned, I think this goes along with what she was saying. My team has a stipend each year for one large mass transportation of everybody on the team to a central location. And the location that we use is the Fedora community's planning and execution conference called Flock, and that's where we bring together a lot of the contributors from around the community, not just people who work for Red Hat, but also volunteers, right? Because we're kind of all in it together, and so we bring a lot of those folks together to talk about where we've been, where are we going, what's on the horizon for the OS, what are some of the next targets that we want to hit, where do we see some opportunities, what kind of tooling do we need for those, who has some ideas about how to get there. How can we put the right people together and encourage them to collaborate to make that a reality? And so my team uses that as our opportunity from both the perspective of Red Hat associates who work together, but then also as community members, right, who work with these volunteers to get together and renew those social bonds. Somewhat with the team, with each other, but then also with our co-contributors who are volunteers and maybe don't work for Red Hat. And as speaking as somebody who came into Fedora and then later Red Hat as a volunteer, I can tell you how powerful that is, right? Meeting people who cared about making this kind of remote collaborative culture possible. Was a huge impact on me, right? It really gave me a lot of tools. It gave me a lot of confidence that I needed, and it came at a perfect time, and really influenced the way that I thought about working with people at a distance.
I wonder if there's a lot of questions here about I can't, a lot of small companies that don't have the budget to bring people together, right? And is it even possible, or what would be, and I don't know if you have the answer because I feel like we're still, this is all still developing, but what can substitute for that in person? I mean, there's so much that happens, balance, right? One might argue, like, I feel like we could build, between the three of us, could build a really good case for why everybody should fly in to one location every time of year. But there's some people that just they can't afford that. What's the substitute? Is there a substitute, right? Like, how does that, I don't know. I mean, what might we be able to do that?
It's like we're doing here. That's how I see it, right? The in-person presence is, I think it's helpful, but I think it's probably like a marginal return over being able to see each other on video, right? Interpret body language, kind of understand how people deliver their message, and then be able to use that as an overlay when you're in a lower bandwidth situation, right? You're talking to people over, Slack or email or whatever the case may be. Yeah. And if you can overlay their personality on that, because you know them visually, you know what their presence looks like. You can use that to sort of serve as a filter and an influence on the communications. And I think it serves as kind of a lubricant in those conversations. I think the in-person meeting is helpful, but and I hope maybe Nikki can comment on this. I see it as kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because you don't want that to become if that becomes the focus for how you're building culture, then it essentially is going to undo the work that you're trying to do in being remote friendly, right? If people have to be together in order to do that. So it's a careful balance, right? It's something that is, it's kind of like a seasoning, right? Too much and you ruin the dish.
I think just to add into this conversation as well, I think the number one thing that we are trying to figure out is how do we create a place where everyone feels like they belong. And I think it's a really complicated question. I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it. I think it's something that we will continue to work on. But there are a couple fun things that we do that I can offer this group as a place to start in terms of ways to get some personality across. How do you take it from, offline to online? How do you layer on some of those technologies to amplify versus be a standalone thing? And so there are a couple things that I took some notes down, Paul, as you were sort of inspiring some thoughts for me, and some thoughts that I thought in looking at some of these questions as well coming through the chat. I know, Josh, you advised us not to, but
that's okay. That's all right. If you can multitask, it's okay.
I couldn't resist either.
No, God, I love your question.
Great.
Something that we do at GitHub is this concept of lightning talks, where every new employee is encouraged to create like a 60-second video introducing who they are as a person, and really bringing some personality to it. Again, we do bring every new employee to HQ for an onboarding. So it's a chance to come together, meet some people beyond your direct team. We also teach in that onboarding session. We do a session led by a remote hubber on a day in the remote life. So whether you're in person or you're going to be working remotely, we all need to practice this good etiquette. So whether it's having a pair of headphones or a good mic set up or good lighting or a strong internet connection, going through some of those tips and what are the benefits and how do we create, parity of outcomes for the perks that we give both remote hubbers and people who work in HQ. So the lightning talks are a really fun way, and whether you're in the recording studio at HQ or you have an iPhone or a Mac, which we give to all our employees as well, to create like a fun video, it's a nice way to introduce who you are to the company, share a little bit more about your personal side of things. We also create some ways for people to share back what it is that they're learning. So we have an L&D benefit, a learning and development benefit, where every hubber has a certain amount that they can go buy books or go to a class or a conference or a workshop. And we ask everyone to share back what it is that they learned. So it's a nice way for people to say, hey, I was really excited about going to this sort of development conference, and here are the key takeaways, and here's some of the collateral. So I want to share back what it is that I'm excited about learning. What am I developing? How can I bring that back to the company? And, you also learn by teaching others. So that's another way to sort of reinforce that. Another fun thing that we do to sort of scale knowledge across the company, especially cross-functionally, like you get a lot of interaction with the people who are on your direct team, but maybe not as much across the company. And so my team's been experimenting. Again, GitHub has a really heavy appetite for experimentation, just like you do in software development. Like we ship and iterate. So if it didn't work this time, let's add to it and make it better the next time, or figure out what went wrong. And so something we've been shipping and iterating is this internal speaker series we call it the Show About What. Again, we like to have a lot of fun. And so my team will reach out to Hubbers with different expertise, whether it's on project management or running retrospectives, or how do you write more effectively in issues, which is something that, again, all of us could probably use improvement on. And having more of an informal dialogue, much like this, sharing some best practices, and creating a lot of space for Q&A. So those are kind of fun. The other cool thing I wanted to share is we hire really smart people at GitHub, and I imagine at Red Hat and whatever companies you all work at, we assume that people are smart and talented and hungry. And we've started putting some formalization around some internal mentoring. So whether it's, engineer to more junior engineer, to create the space for people to come together and learn and have some focused goals. So we're using an external tool to help us there, and we are in a pilot mode right now, but in the future, I could see this as an opportunity for cross-functional Hubbers to learn from one another. So if someone in support wants to get better at presentations, maybe someone in sales is awesome at that. And so being able to connect people based on the goals that they have and the skills that we have internally, and then where those gaps exist where we don't have the skills, figuring out how do we help people connect with people maybe outside of the organization who can help them develop in those areas. So I think there are a lot of fun, informal things that you can do to experiment, whether it's the lightning talks. Sometimes teams will do a virtual happy hour, bring your own beverage, hop on Zoom. There's no agenda, but just come and have a conversation. There are a lot of different things that you can do, and you don't have to be a leader in your company to do it. You can drive it from the bottom up. There was a question around grassroots. And I think that's pretty cool. Paul, what are some cool, fun, informal things that you've seen work really well at Red Hat that you might offer this group?
It's just hilarious. I'm loving having this conversation because I feel like, Nicky and I seem to have all these experiences in common, coming from different, slightly different perspectives, but we've reached a lot of the same answers and tried a lot of the same things. And, it seems like they're successful. So it sounds to me like that's a great, a great place to be having this discussion from. You mentioned having talks. I actually proctor a series of talks inside Red Hat, and this is kind of engineering specific because that's where I'm located, obviously. But I proctor a set of engineering tech talks where we invite speakers from around the department to come in to talk about their new project that they're working on, an idea that they had for solving a customer problem, whatever the case might be, right? And they can actually get that out in front of their peers before even before the bulk of the code starts to land, right? So the idea is to sort of debug the idea a bit, or start with very early code and, like you said, iterate on it. And that's something that's actually been fantastic specifically for our remotees. Someone in the chat asked a question about, and I've been reading it too. So she asked a question, or maybe it was he, I'm sorry, asked a question about how do you make sure that remotees feel involved in something like lunch and learn series, right? Or these growth opportunities. And one of the ways that I've tried to do that is by having these engineering tech talks not be primarily held from one location, right? But rather inviting people from around the company and specifically reaching out to remotees, right? To have them connect up with people in the office, right? So these folks are seen as leading in their area, and sometimes they're actually lecturing or teaching or instructing or delivering information to some of the co-located groups on what they're doing, right? And so that person sees, oh wow, that's a new project we hadn't heard of. This really solves a problem. Let's talk about how to do this. Let's get offline and discuss it. And that I think has been a big help. You talked about informal activities. I'll I'll bring up one probably silly approach, but it was I remember doing these for a while, and it was fantastic. We've kind of fallen off the schedule, but there was a time where a bunch of us around not just in the Fedora team, but different parts of Red Hat who knew each other through the Fedora community and some other communities would get together and have like a poker night that we'd get together. So as a bunch of people, we'd literally get on a video chat like this, and we would play a poker game. It was like just an online application that you could get where everybody can see each other's view of the table as if you were sitting there, right? But then we'd also be on a video chat so we can trash talk each other and be silly and have a good time. And it was a lot of fun.
You guys, I've got bad news, is that we're at the end of our time. All right, Nicky's even starting the thread getting in here. So you guys, this has been amazing, and I feel like we can have another like 2 hours. Here's what I would suggest. So I want to first of all thank Paul and Nicky for being part of this experiment that we're doing here at Culture Lab. I want everyone to, if you enjoyed this, please go to culturelabx.com and either sign up for the newsletter or link to connect your LinkedIn profile to become part of our community. We will be promoting these. We're going to try to host these type of events every other month. And if you are in one of the cities that we have a Culture Lab, you can look that up. And if you don't, you can even apply to start a lab in your own city. We're going to follow up with an email out to everybody. And what I would suggest is Culture Lab has a Slack channel. You can email me, josh@culturelabx.com, and I'll invite you to the Slack channel. And what I'll do right after we hop off this call is I'll start a remote culture channel inside of Slack, and Nicky and Paul, we can maybe get you in there and we can continue this conversation, because this has been really, really compelling and really powerful. So thank you everybody for making this the most well-attended Culture Lab Live. Hopefully we'll continue the thread, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun, and feel free to follow me on Twitter, and I'm happy to engage in this conversation online. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks, you guys.